On the obsidian spire of the Valerii Hegemony, there are 3 rules every Terran auxiliary learns before they are even allowed to breathe the recycled, ozone-scented air of the inner sanctum. First, never look a Valerii High Commander in the primary eyes. Second, never speak unless the chime of their translator authorizes a frequency. Third, and most importantly, do not touch the Aethel-Blade. To the Valerii, a species of avian-descended aristocrats who stood 7 feet tall and spoke in chords that could shatter glass, the Aethel-Blade wasn't just a weapon. It was a crystalline extension of their neural network, a reservoir of ancestral memory forged from singing quartz. To touch it was to touch their soul. To clean it without a priestly rite was an act of such profound intimacy, or desecration, that the Valerii didn't even have a word for it. They just had an execution protocol. Arthur Penhaligon, a grade 4 maintenance tech with grease under his fingernails and a persistent habit of humming 20th century jazz, was currently breaking all 3 rules. He wasn't trying to be a rebel. He was just tired. The siege of Xylos had lasted 6 months, and the Valerii liberators were as exhausted as the humans they commanded. High General Valen, a creature of terrifying grace with iridescent charcoal feathers and eyes like dying stars, had stormed into the maintenance bay 3 hours ago. She had slammed her sidearm and her ceremonial blade onto Arthur's workbench, barked something about corrosive xeno-ichor, and vanished to an emergency war council. "Dumb," Arthur muttered, squinting through his jeweler's loupe. "Leaving a phase-shifted molecular edge covered in acidic bile, it'll pit the quartz." He knew he should have called the Valerii Shapers. He knew he should have waited for the chanting and the incense. But Arthur saw a tool in distress, and he was a man who couldn't stand a blunt edge. He reached for the forbidden hilt. As his skin made contact with the warm, vibrating crystal, a low hum vibrated through his marrow. He felt a faint, ghostly tug at the back of his mind, a flicker of cold wind, and the scent of ancient forests. But he brushed it off as a static discharge. He grabbed a microfiber cloth and a bottle of specialized Terran solvent. "Let's get you polished up, beautiful," he whispered. He worked with a rhythmic, stubborn honesty. He scrubbed away the green-black gore of the Vex invaders. He used a precision pick to clear the gunk from the filigree of the hilt. He didn't see the blade as a holy relic. He saw it as a piece of engineering that deserved respect. He polished the crystal until it glowed with a soft, rhythmic violet light, pulsing like a heartbeat. He was so focused on a stubborn spot of carbon scoring near the crossguard that he didn't hear the doors hiss open. He didn't notice the sudden, suffocating silence that fell over the bay. He didn't see the 20 elite Sun Guard warriors freeze mid-stride, their halberds dropping in collective shock, and he certainly didn't notice High General Valen standing 5 feet away, her primary eyes wide, her crest feathers standing straight up in a display of total, ego-shattering vulnerability. Arthur gave the blade one last buff, held it up to the light, and nodded. "There. Good as new. You really ought to take better care of—" He turned around and stopped dead. The general wasn't looking at him with fury. She was looking at him with something far more terrifying, a look of soul-deep recognition. The lead Sun Guard finally found his voice, a screeching discord of horrified notes. "The unbidden has bonded. He has tasted the life song. The blood debt is sealed." Valen stepped forward, her taloned hand trembling as she reached for the glowing blade Arthur was still holding. As her hand closed over his on the hilt, a shockwave of violet light erupted, throwing the guards back. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He had just wanted to fix a piece of equipment. Instead, he felt a tether snap into place between his mind and the alien generals. "Human," Valen whispered, her voice no longer a command but a shaky plea. "Do you have any idea what you have just signed?" Arthur swallowed hard, looking from the glowing sword to the towering, beautiful alien commander. "I'm guessing a thank you is out of the question." The interrogation room was less of a dungeon and more of a cathedral made of glass and gravity. Arthur sat on a floating plinth in the center of the high spire's judgment tier, surrounded by a ring of Valerii elders who looked like ancient, molting vultures draped in silk. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and incense, and every time Arthur moved, the shackles on his wrists, made of hard light, hummed in warning. At the head of the circle sat High General Valen. She had traded her battle-worn armor for robes of shimmering midnight blue, but she still wore the Aethel-Blade at her hip. The crystal was pulsing in perfect synchronization with Arthur's own heartbeat. It was an unnerving, rhythmic thumping in his ears that told him exactly how nervous she was, even if her face remained a mask of regal indifference. "Arthur Penhaligon," the High Inquisitor hissed, his voice a series of clicking trills. "You have performed the Sunder Bond. You have laid profane hands upon the soul anchor of a scion of the First House. By all laws of the hegemony, your atoms should be scattered across the void." Arthur looked up. He was a small man in a stained jumpsuit, facing creatures that could erase his star system with a single command. But Arthur was from Earth. Specifically, he was from a long line of mechanics who didn't like being told they'd done a bad job. "Look," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "I've already told you. The blade was filthy. It was oxidizing. If I hadn't cleaned it, the structural integrity of the lattice would have been compromised by morning." A gasp rippled through the council. To speak of the Aethel-Blade as a piece of lattice was like calling a holy icon a decorative paperweight. "You speak of integrity?" the Inquisitor screamed, his crest flared. "You touch the General's essence. You have entered the life debt. You are now bound to her, her shadow, her shield, her burden, until one of you ceases to breathe." Valen remained silent, her primary eyes fixed on Arthur. She was watching the way he didn't tremble. She was watching the way he looked at her, not as a terrifying goddess of war, but as a person who had been neglectful with her gear. "I'm sorry," Arthur said, and the word sorry hit the room like a physical blow. The Valerii didn't do apologies. They did atonement, or they did vengeance. "I really am. I didn't mean to trigger some ancient cosmic contract. I just saw someone I saw a commanding officer who looked like she'd been through hell." "You looked exhausted, General. Your blade looked worse. I thought I'd do one small thing to make your day easier when you got back." The Inquisitor leaned forward, his beak clicking in derision. "You offer a kindness as a defense for heresy?" "It's not a defense," Arthur said, standing up despite the hard-light shackles pulling at his skin. "It's an apology to Valen, not to the High General or the scion of the house, to her. She's been leading this front for 6 months without sleep. She's a person, isn't she? Doesn't she deserve a clean blade without having to fill out a requisition form for a priest?" The silence that followed was absolute. Valen's secondary eyes, the ones used for emotional processing, dilated. In the history of the hegemony, no one had ever defended a protocol breach by citing the emotional state of the sovereign. It was irrational. It was messy. It was quintessentially human. Valen stood, her robes whispering against the floor. "The human is correct," she said, her voice a low, resonating chord that silenced the Inquisitor. "He saw the fatigue in my marrow that you all chose to ignore in favor of your maps and charts. He treated the General as a symbol, but he treated Valen as a soul." She turned to the council, her hand resting on the hilt of the blade that was currently glowing a warm, contented amber. "The debt stands. He cannot be executed. He is my shadow now." "General, this is a scandal," the Inquisitor protested. "A maintenance tech? A monkey from a Tier 3 world?" "A monkey who knows how to polish quartz," Arthur muttered under his breath. Valen looked at Arthur, and for a fleeting second, the corner of her beak curved in something that might have been a smile. "Take him to the private quarters. If we are to be bound for life, I believe I should at least learn why he hums those strange, rhythmic melodies while he works." The General's private sanctum was a soaring vault of translucent alabaster, overlooking the swirling nebulae of the Xylo's reach. It was a place of sterile, terrifying beauty. No soft edges, no clutter, and certainly no warmth. Arthur stood by a panoramic window, feeling decidedly out of place in his grease-stained coveralls against the backdrop of a literal empire. The door hissed open, and Valen entered alone. Without the heavy ceremonial robes or the terrifying sun guard escort, she looked smaller, not in physical stature, but in weight. The invisible burden of command seemed to sag her shoulders just a fraction. "You are a very strange creature, Arthur Penhaligon," she said, her voice dropping the resonance of the court for a softer, more melodic tone. "I get that a lot," Arthur replied, turning from the view. Usually followed by, "Get your boots off the upholstery." Speaking of which, I'm sorry about the life debt thing. If there's a way to, I don't know, unsign the receipt, I'm happy to go back to fixing fusion torches. Valen walked toward him, the Aethel-Blade at her side pulsing with a gentle, rhythmic violet light that matched Arthur's pulse. "It is not a contract that can be shredded. When you polished the crystal with such singular intent, you spoke to the memories stored within. You didn't approach it with fear or worship. You approached it with care. The blade recognized a protector. It chose you as my Ansala, my shadow heart." She sat on a low, high-backed bench and gestured for him to do the same. Arthur hesitated, then sat, keeping a respectful distance. "My people live by the song of logic," Valen continued, staring at her taloned hands. "Every action is calculated for the benefit of the hegemony. Every emotion is filtered through protocol. To show exhaustion is to show a crack in the foundation. To show grief is to invite collapse." "That sounds exhausting," Arthur said bluntly. "No wonder you looked like you were ready to drop when you came into the bay." Valen looked at him, her primary eyes blinking in slow succession. "You saw that? Truly?" "General, I'm a mechanic. My entire life is about looking at things and seeing where the stress fractures are. You had catastrophic failure written all over your face. I just thought, well, if I could take one thing off your plate, maybe you wouldn't snap." Valen reached out, her long, slender fingers hovering just inches from Arthur's hand. For a Valerii, physical touch outside of combat or mating was unheard of, but the person-first gravity of the human was pulling at her. "In my world," she whispered, "I am a symbol. I am the aegis of the void. I am the will of the High House. No one has looked at me and seen a person in 300 years. "Then your world is missing out," Arthur said, offering a small, lopsided smile. "Humans are messy. We cry at movies. We get angry at inanimate objects, and we definitely snap when we're tired. But we see each other. It's how we survive." As he spoke, he saw the mask of the High General slip. The rigid set of her beak relaxed. A soft, trilling sound, a Valerii purr, vibrated in her chest. For the first time, the shimmering, cold goddess of war looked seen. She looked relieved. "Tell me of this jazz you hum," she said, her eyes softening. "It has a chaotic frequency. It shouldn't be pleasing to a Valerii ear, and yet the blade hums along with it." Arthur chuckled. "It's about the notes you don't play, General. It's about finding beauty in the middle of the mess." The moment of quiet connection was shattered by a sudden, violent shudder that rocked the entire spire. The alabaster walls groaned, and a crimson alarm light began to strobe against the white stone. "General," a voice crackled over the comms. "The Vex, they've bypassed the perimeter cloaking. They're inside the inner sanctum." Valen was on her feet in a heartbeat, the Aethel-Blade snapping into her hand, glowing with a fierce, murderous light. But as she turned toward the door, she stumbled. A dark, jagged dart was lodged in her shoulder, a Vex neural paralyzer. Arthur didn't think. He didn't check the protocol. He simply lunged forward to catch the falling queen of the stars. The paralyzer dart was a jagged shard of obsidian glass, pulsing with a sickly, rhythmic green light. Valen's wings flared once, a spasm of iridescent feathers, before she collapsed against Arthur. He caught her, his boots skidding on the polished alabaster floor. She was surprisingly light, hollow-boned like the predatory birds of Earth's ancient past, but the weight of the moment was crushing. "General! Valen!" Arthur hissed, dragging her behind a heavy decorative plinth of solid quartz. Outside the sanctum doors, the rhythmic thud hiss of Vex bioarmor echoed through the corridor. The Vex were a hive mind of synthetic locusts, terrifyingly efficient and utterly devoid of mercy. They didn't capture. They harvested. Valen's primary eyes were rolled back, her breathing a ragged whistling sound. The Aethel-Blade lay inches from her hand, its violet glow flickering like a dying candle. Because of the life debt, Arthur felt a sharp, sympathetic sting in his own shoulder. His vision blurred for a second, a wave of cold nausea washing over him. Right, Arthur muttered, his jaw setting in that particular brand of human stubbornness that usually preceded a very bad idea. Unarmored grit. Here we go. He didn't have a pulse rifle. He didn't have a kinetic shield. He had a heavy-duty adjustable wrench clipped to his belt and a small canister of rapid seal industrial foam used for patching hull breaches. The doors hissed open. 3 Vex infiltrators skittered in, multi-limbed nightmares with sensor eyes that glowed like embers. They moved with a terrifying jerky precision, their bladed limbs clicking against the stone. Arthur didn't wait for them to scan the room. He knew the Valerii architecture better than they did. He'd spent the last month recalibrating the climate sensors in this very wing. He reached up, tore a decorative silk hanging from the wall, and wrapped it around his hand. "Hey! Over here, you overgrown crickets!" Arthur roared. As the Vex pivoted, Arthur didn't retreat. He sprinted toward them. It was a move so tactically incorrect that the Vex's predictive algorithms stuttered for a microsecond. He slid across the floor, human style, and sprayed the industrial foam directly into the sensor cluster of the lead infiltrator. The foam expanded instantly, hardening into a rock-solid opaque mass. The Vex shrieked, a sound like metal grinding on metal, and began flailing blindly. Arthur didn't stop. He swung his heavy wrench with the practiced strength of a man who spent 10 hours a day torquing starship bolts. Crack. The wrench connected with the neck joint of the second Vex, shattering the delicate fiber optics. But the third Vex was faster. It lunged, its monomolecular blade whistling toward Arthur's chest. He rolled, feeling the heat of the blade graze his shoulder, and scrambled toward the Aethel-Blade. As his hand closed around the hilt, the world exploded in color. The life debt wasn't just a legal contract. It was a conduit. The blade recognized the shadow heart in distress. A surge of Valen's own tactical brilliance, her centuries of combat muscle memory, flooded into Arthur's nervous system. He didn't know how to sword fight, but the blade did. In one fluid, shimmering motion, Arthur spun. The violet light of the sword carved a perfect arc through the air, shearing through the third Vex's torso as if it were made of warm butter. The synthetic creature collapsed into a heap of sparking wires and black ichor. Arthur stood there panting, the glowing sword humming a triumphant jazz-like chord in his hand. He looked down at Valen. Her eyes were open now, tracking him with a mixture of horror and awe. You used the blade," she whispered, the paralyzer's toxin slowly fading. "No human, no non-Valerii, has ever survived the neural feedback." Arthur wiped a smudge of Vex grease from his forehead and offered her a shaky hand. "Well, General, like I said, we're stubborn, and I really, really hate it when people touch my tools without asking." Valen took his hand, her talons clicking gently against his skin. The Shadow Heart was no longer just a title. It was a reality. The air in the triage center was thick with the smell of scorched ozone and medicinal salve. Valen sat on a biobed, her wing bandaged in shimmering silk, while Arthur leaned against a nearby diagnostic console. He was covered in black Vex ichor, his jumpsuit torn and his knuckles raw. Around them, the Valerii High Command was in a state of controlled panic. The invincible Obsidian Spire had been breached, and the savior was a human maintenance tech who had wielded a neural link blade without his brain liquefying. "The resonance," Valen whispered, her eyes tracking the Aethel-Blade where it rested on a table between them. "It hasn't faded. Usually, after a combat surge, the bond quiets. But with you, it's singing." "It's just feedback, General," Arthur said, though his hand was still buzzing with a phantom warmth. "Like a grounded wire. It'll pass." "No," she countered, her voice gaining its regal strength. "It is not feedback. It is a choice. The blade is reflecting your refusal to let go." "Why did you stay, Arthur?" "The Vex protocols would have ignored a non-combatant. You could have hidden in the vents. Arthur looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the Empress of 1,000 stars, but he also saw the woman who had let her mask slip in the quiet of her chambers. Back home we have a saying, "You don't leave your people behind. You're my commanding officer, Valen. And you were the first person in this whole fleet who actually looked at me like I was more than a walking wrench." Before she could respond, the heavy blast doors hissed open. A phalanx of the High Council's personal guard marched in, led by the Inquisitor from the Judgment Tier. His crest was flared to its maximum height, a sign of extreme territorial aggression. "General Valen," the Inquisitor clicked, his voice harsh. "The crisis is contained, but the spiritual contamination is not. This creature has wielded the ancestral memory. He has tasted the secrets of the First House. Protocol 19B is clear. The vessel of the bond must be neutralized to preserve the sanctity of the lineage." Valen stood up, her movements fluid and predatory despite her injury. "He saved my life, Inquisitor. He saved the Spire." "He is a biological anomaly," the Inquisitor shrieked. "A human cannot hold the song. It is a mockery of our history. If you do not relinquish him to the silence, the Council will declare you unfit. You will lose the hegemony." Arthur felt the cold weight of the threat. This was the HFY moment, the point where the alien logic of purity met the human logic of loyalty. He stepped forward, putting himself between the general and the guards. He didn't have the blade this time, but he had that stubborn Terran set to his jaw. "You want to talk about unfit?" Arthur asked, his voice low and steady. "Your perfect protocols let the Vex into your bedroom. Your perfect logic says it's better to kill the guy who saved your general than to admit your sword liked a human's touch. That's not leadership. That's just being afraid of change." "Silence, primate," the Inquisitor barked. "No," Valen said, her voice a thunderclap that echoed off the crystalline walls. She reached out and gripped Arthur's shoulder, not as a superior, but as a partner. "He stays. You speak of sanctity, but the Aethel-Blade is brighter now than it has been in a century. It doesn't want a priest. It wants a heart that beats with the courage to defy the dark." She looked at the Inquisitor, her primary eyes burning. "If the Council wishes to challenge my fitness based on my choice of shadow, let them. But they should remember, I still hold the blade, and the human holds the wrench that fixed it." The Inquisitor recoiled, his feathers flattening in genuine fear. He realized in that moment that the bond wasn't a mistake. It was an evolution. The Grand Conclave was a hovering disk of translucent marble, suspended over the core of the Valerii homeworld, Aethelgard. Below, the city spires pierced the clouds like silver needles. Above, the High Council sat in a tiered semicircle, their ancient multicolored plumage creating a kaleidoscope of rigid tradition. The air was thick with the scent of judicial incense, a heavy aromatic musk designed to dull the nerves of the accused. But Arthur Penhaligon wasn't feeling dull. He was feeling annoyed. He stood in the center of the disk, still in his repaired maintenance coveralls, which he had insisted on wearing despite the silken stardust wardrobe Valen's attendants had tried to force on him. Valen stood at his side, her wings partially unfurled in a protective stance that sent whispers of scandal, rippling through the assembly like a physical wave. "The bond is a biological fluke," the arch-prelate shrieked, his voice cracking with age. "A human male, a Tier 3 scavenger linked to the scion of the First House? It is a biological obscenity. It defies the song of the ancestors." Valen stepped forward, her hand resting on the hilt of the Aethel-Blade. "The ancestors built this hegemony on the principle of resonance. Is there any among you who can say this blade does not resonate with the human?" The blade pulsed, not with the cold measured beat of a Valerii warrior, but with a syncopated, lively rhythm. It was a jazz beat, stubborn and swinging. "It is infected," the Inquisitor cried, pointing a trembling talon. "He has corrupted the soul anchor with his chaotic impulses." Arthur had finally had enough. He stepped out from Valen's shadow, ignoring the shocked gasps of the Council. He looked up at the tiers of ancient, feathered aristocrats and didn't bow. He didn't even blink. You keep talking about corruption and infection like I'm a virus, Arthur said, his voice echoing with the blunt honesty of a man who had spent his life staring into the guts of broken engines. But let's talk about the song for a second. You've been singing the same tune for 10,000 years. It's perfect, sure, it's logical. And it's completely, utterly stuck. How dare, the archprelate began. I dare because I fixed the general's blade when your priests were too busy chanting to notice it was rotting, Arthur shouted over them. Humanity doesn't have a song. We have a noise. We have a mess of different voices all shouting at once. And yeah, it's chaotic. But you know what happens when you add a new instrument to a song that's gone stale? You get something better. You get a harmony you didn't think was possible. He turned to Valen, then back to the council. I didn't sign a life debt because I wanted to be a hero. I did it because your general was drowning in your perfect expectations, and I was the only one who bothered to throw her a rope. If your ancestors are so fragile that a little human grit breaks their legacy, then maybe your legacy wasn't that strong to begin with. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the silence of a 1,000-year-old machine finally coming to a grinding halt. The High Counselors looked at each other, their primary eyes blinking in a frantic, confused sequence. They were looking for a protocol to handle plain speaking, and they were finding nothing but empty data packets. Then, from the back of the chamber, a single, low trill began. It was an elder, one of the oldest survivors of the Vex Wars. Slowly, he stood, his feathers molting and gray. The human speaks a truth that the song has forgotten. The elder resonated. Strength is not found in the absence of flaws but in the repair of them. The general's blade was broken. The human restored it. The general's spirit was weary. The human revived it. He looked at Valen and Arthur. The scandal is not that a human has joined us. The scandal is that it took us this long to find a species brave enough to tell us we were out of tune. The tide turned. The whispers changed from desecration to evolution. Valen's hand found Arthur's, her talons gripping his fingers with a strength that said she was never letting go. The obsidian spire was quiet, but it was no longer cold. 6 months had passed since the scandal of the conclave, and the Valerii Hegemony was vibrating with a strange new energy. On the observation deck, where the stars of the Xylo's reach burned like spilled diamonds, Arthur Penhaligon sat on a low-maintenance bench. He wasn't alone. High General Valen sat beside him, her wings draped casually over the back of the seat. She was wearing a modified version of a Terran flight jacket over her ceremonial silks, a gift from Arthur that had sparked a fashion revolution among the younger Valerii officers. Between them sat a small, battered metal box. Inside was a collection of Earth artifacts, a harmonica, a collection of vintage blueprints, and a jar of high-viscosity engine grease. The Council approved the Joint Defense Treaty this morning, Valen said, her voice a warm, melodic trill. The first Terran engineers will arrive at the Spire next week. They are allowed people, Arthur. My logistics officers are already complaining about the rhythmic thumping coming from the human barracks. That's just the base, General, Arthur grinned, leaning back. You get used to it. Besides, your tech guys are finally learning how to use a crescent wrench. That's progress. Valen looked down at her hands that had once only known the grip of a weapon or the weight of a decree. Now they were stained with a bit of graphite from helping Arthur recalibrate a stabilizer. I was told by the High Priest that my soul had been compromised by your influence. He said I was becoming messy. And? Arthur asked, raising an eyebrow. And I told him that messy is simply another word for alive, she replied. She reached out and touched the hilt of the Aethel-Blade which rested on the bench between them. The crystal didn't glow with the blinding, aggressive light of a weapon anymore. It pulsed with a soft, steady amber, the color of a Terran sunset. Because of the life debt, Arthur felt the warmth of her contentment as if it were his own. It was a constant, comforting background hum, like the sound of a well-tuned engine. You know, Arthur said, looking out at the fleet of Valerii and Terran ships flying in formation. I really did just mean to clean the thing. I had a whole weekend planned. I was going to catch up on my sleep and maybe eat some of that synthesized steak that tastes like cardboard. Valen leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of profound intimacy that would have caused a riot in the conclave just months ago. A life debt is a heavy price for a clean blade, Arthur Penhaligon. Do you regret it? Arthur looked at the Empress of the Stars, the woman who had learned to laugh, the warrior who had found a partner in a grease monkey from a Tier 3 world. He felt the bond, the stubborn, honest, beautiful connection that defied every law of the galaxy. Nah, Arthur said, his voice soft and full of wit. The pay is terrible, and the hours are worse, but the company's not bad. Besides, someone has to make sure you don't pit the quartz again. You're terrible at maintenance, Valen. Valen let out a genuine bird-like chirp of laughter. Then it is fortunate I have a shadow who is so stubbornly honest. As the suns of Aethel-Blade set, casting long, golden shadows across the deck, the human and the alien sat in a silence that was no longer empty. It was a harmony, a new song being written, one note at a time, by a man who refused to follow protocol and a queen who decided to finally be a person. If you enjoyed this story of human resilience and interspecies connection, please like, share, and subscribe to the HFY Soundscape channel for more tales from the stars.